Hello, everyone. Welcome to Your Desk University. My name is Jared Friedman. I'm a senior technical designer at Walter P. Moore. And today I'll be joined with my colleague, Timon Hazell, who's also a senior technical designer at Walter P. Moore, who, if you've been tuning in in the past episodes, you guys are all familiar with Timon. And so today the talk is going to be about developing libraries with Python that could be used throughout Dynamo and pyRevit and RhinoInside Revit. For people working in architecture and engineering offices, we're often using these various platforms and people have different preferences. And rather than try to force everyone into one platform, we're going to look at how you can reutilize code throughout various platforms. Thursday night, we're going to be joined by Isan, who is the developer of pyRevit and who now works on RhinoInside Revit at McNeil. He's going to be talking about developing good documentation. Should be a really good episode. I'm pretty excited to see that one. And without further ado, today, we're all familiar with Timon by now at this point, hopefully, but I'm going to hand it off to Timon, and he's going to go ahead. And then remember to please ask questions in the chat. A lot of what Timon is going to be showing are things I'm familiar with, so um, it's going to be hard for me to develop good questions. I'm going to rely on you guys to come up with some good ones so we can grill him on them. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to you, Timon.
Hey everybody, welcome. I'm gonna make a quick adjustment here on my computer and then we will be ready to go live. So let's see here. Can we switch here? Stop my video. Start my video. Hey, there we go. Cool. I'm gonna share my screen. So today we're gonna talk about building a Python library that we can reuse in RhinoInside, in Grasshopper, in Dynamo, and pyRevit. I spend most of my time in pyRevit these days, but all this work is really helpful for being able to use the same code snippets over and over in other things. So with that, let's get to the presentation. Share my screen. Perfect. Here. All right. Sorry about this, guys. Oh, of course, you can't have something like this live without technical difficulties, and today's definitely going to be true for that. We're gonna do live Grasshopper Dynamo Python, and if we can't figure out our PowerPoint, we're in big trouble. So
Live PowerPoint troubleshooting.
live PowerPoint troubleshooting.
Bonus.
Definitely.
Freebie for everyone.
Yeah, as you saw in the chat over there, we really want to know, it'd be helpful as we're going to know if you're mostly a Dynamo user, mostly a Grasshopper user, mostly a Python developer. If you're using just kind of just trying to learn anything, give us a little bit of input. I'm watching that so that I can understand who I'm speaking to. So the problem statement. We've been told for many years, we all know this, that we don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over. So the answer to that has been automating things. Automating things in Dynamo, automating them in Grasshopper, in pyRevit. However, we're now in a new situation where we want to not be repeating our automation techniques. So we might write something, we might figure out how to connect different nodes together, and then we realize, oh, these are nodes we want to be using again and again and again. So people started developing packages. They just started developing different add-ins and extensions depending on the different platform that they're using. And we're going to kind of develop something like that today together, just a micro little package, but it's going to live locally on your computers, and it's going to be software agnostic. So it's going to work in Dynamo, it's going to work in Grasshopper, it's going to work in RhinoInside Grasshopper, kind of the same. And then third, it'll work in pyRevit. So yeah, 3 applications, but we're all automating Revit. So that for today's class, for this here, we're going to focus on Revit being kind of centric. I know there's other platforms, but a lot of the industry is using Revit as their primary documentation design software. So we're going to focus on that part about it. And with the changes in RhinoInside over the last, I guess last 2 years, It's given the power of being able to do this with Rhino on top of Revit, and so that's really where this becomes applicable. So what are we talking about? We're talking about some kind of engine that lives in the middle here, where we have things that come from Revit. They go through either Dynamo, pyRevit, Grasshopper. They go to this engine, and then they come back out, go back into Dynamo, Python, or Grasshopper, depending on how you're using it, and then it goes into Revit. So if we were to kind of think about that a little bit, it might be that you're grabbing something from Revit here with Dynamo. In that case, if you're using Dynamo, I'm going to try to use my mouse here. I know it's tiny on the screen there. Then once it goes into the engine, you're going to want to come back into Dynamo and use it. If you're starting with a different application, you're going to want the engine that we're creating to spit back out into that application that we're working with. So with that, we are going to focus on the Revit API, and I know a lot of the people who are tuned in know quite a bit about the Revit API, so we'll flip through this really quick for those who may not be really savvy about it. But all of these applications in the back end are using the Revit API DLL. And this here, a DLL, is a library. That library is the easiest way to access it is either revitapdocs.com. I think it's .com. Revit. If you search Revit API docs, maybe Jared can chime in.
There's also apidocs.co,
And this,
which
yeah,
has a variety of different libraries, not just Revit. So I think that's probably the latest and greatest, but this one is also still up and running.
yeah, perfect. And those are
Thanks to
all.
Guy Tellerico.
Yeah, thank you, Guy. A lot of what we're talking about is connected in a lot of ways to him. If you go down into the links below, you will find all of these references linked down there. But so that I'm not just creating something, telling you something that isn't real, I want to kind of show this in action. So this is our folder on our computer with program files, Autodesk Revit 2020. In here, I found the Revit API DLL, that library. I'm dragging it into this reader. Inside of here, I can go down to the classes and the namespaces that I'm working. So I'm going to look at DB, and I'm going to go down and look at a point, and I want to make a point here about my point. And so in Revit, they're called XYZ elements or classes. And so they have an X, they have a Y, they have a Z, but this is the information that describes what a point is in Revit. And that's important because, I'm actually going to skip ahead here a second. That's important because different programs are going to define a point slightly differently. So when we're trying to build something to talk to multiple programs, we have to understand that a point might be described in different ways in different programs. So just now I showed it in Revit, and this is on the left here, you can see in Revit. So the Revit XYZ class or point has some properties, which I've shown just a few of the properties and methods here on the screen. And we can see here on the right-hand side, this is using the Rhino API, and the Rhino has a class called point3D. And that point3D, for example, it has an element inside of it called or a property called origin or XYZ. So as you can see, they both have XYZ, but we kind of have to think of them as different languages. I thought for many, many different ways of trying to define this, but it's kind of like speaking different languages, and so we have to translate between the languages as we go. So at the center of our engine, we are going to be using Revit API because that's going to be pretty standard between them. But sometimes, for example, in Dynamo, you might have to use I think it's unwrap elements or to XYZ or to point3D to convert from a Dynamo geometry element to a Revit geometry element. And Grasshopper has the same things. And some of this we're going to say, over multiple times, but I hope that point kind of sticks in, that these are all different languages. And so we have to understand how to translate between them to make this successful. So going back here a little bit. So at the very basic, the simplest thing we can do in a library would be we trigger the library and it does something. So this is going to be one of our first examples. We're going to log script usage. Obviously, that's not the most helpful thing for automating different tasks, but it's a very simple thing to be showing, to show us on screen as a first example, because we trigger it, we send a trigger to the library runs some code, and then does something. It doesn't have to return anything. There might be a little bit more complicated ones where you trigger it, the library or the engine, I'm calling it, does something and then it returns something. And sometimes you won't have to translate in the middle. So if I'm using PyRevit and PyRevit is using the Revit API, then my engine doesn't have to translate anything, and then I don't have to translate anything when it comes back. But sometimes we will have to work through this translation. And some people call this wrapping or unwrapping different elements or different classes, so that you kind of create a wrapper around your objects inside that library, and they can be used in a slightly different way than you would if you're just using with them natively. Okay, I know that's been really crazy fast and just kind of quick high level touching on what this kind of concept is going to be. But all this is because we don't want to redo our logic. We don't want to redo our programming that we've done. So as we've talked about, so here's an example of two places that I found, and I'll show these references. They're also down in the links. But if we're working with Dynamo, this translation happens using some of these methods. So if we have an XYZ point from Revit and we want to use the Dynamo version, we use XYZ to point. If we want to convert a geometry object from Dynamo to Revit, we would use this here to Revit type. So those are some of the ways that it translates. If we look at the API inside of Grasshopper, it's very similar, but it uses a different method because it's obviously developed by different people. There's different systems in there, and there you can see this convert. So inside of RhinoInside, there's a class called convert, and if we look here down at the bottom, we can see convert to host. So that'll take like a mesh and convert it from Rhino mesh into a Revit mesh. Again, that's kind of weird, but to understand this, you will have to understand how that general stuff works. And I often just think of it as different languages. So if each of my programs is speaking a different language, I have to translate between them so that I can understand so that one thing can understand how they're talking. Yeah. All right. So what about PyRevit? We've talked about these other two. So first, I want to pause and say we're talking about two massive applications with huge development teams, and then we're talking about PyRevit and Revit. PyRevit, which is mostly developed by Isan, who's our speaker next Thursday. I'm so grateful for all the things that he's done, and I'm sure you are too. If you want to tell him thank you on the chat here or in the comments, it's a good time. I really love that interactive part. And I really appreciate everything that he's done. So if you do too, say something. So PyRevit is mostly built using the Revit API directly. And so most of the calls, most of the commands inside of there are just going to be straight Python accessing the Revit API. And there's not a lot of translation that has to happen. RPW does a little bit of inside of it. And RPW is Revit Python wrapper. It's designed so that you can do the same thing in multiple places. So in Dynamo, in PyRevit, in Revit Python shell, you can kind of do the same commands in a slightly easier way. So this library, this engine we're going to be building is in some ways going to be kind of emulate that, but maybe for your private repo. So the three examples we're going to do is we're going to log usage. We're going to display selected element parameter data. There's a typo. And there you go. And so for that, again, it's just to kind of showcase how this can be done another way, but we're just going to make a pop-up that shows us all the parameter data from an object that we select or send to the engine. And we're going to do that in Dynamo, we're going to do that in Grasshopper, and we're going to do that in PyRevit. So we're going to do the same thing 3 times, but we're going to use only one set of code to do it. And then the third is on-screen QC of mirrored elements. So sometimes, I'm a structural engineer, so you might say, well, why is this a problem? I'm an architect, and I know it's a problem with doors. But we're building a lot of our models now for fabrication, and we're trying to send them to Tekla. And one of the important things when people get all of the information into Tekla is they need it in there in a very clean, very standardized method. And if we have mirrored objects, or if we have elements in pointing different directions, then we're not going to be able to do fabrication drawings off of those structural models. So that's where mirrored elements applies for us, but I know that doors being mirrored is a massive problem for architects. It's probably one of the top questions I've seen on the forums repeatedly. So with that, let's start on the live portion. Any questions so far? I'm going to pause for a minute because I tend to talk really fast. Jared, if you want to cut me off here.
I think you're doing well. We don't see any questions coming in yet. It's like we have a lot of PyRevit users,
Very
a
nice.
couple Grasshopper users.
Yeah, welcome guys. I see Daniel, Clifford, Patrick, Pudding. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Also in the description below, there is a link to a Dropbox account, and that has all of the source material for today. I don't know if that'll stay there very long, but it's definitely there for those of us who are live. So thanks for joining us. Okay, so with that, let's go and let's start in Dynamo. A lot of us are familiar with Dynamo, and we're going to be focusing mostly on the Python side of things. So let's say I want to log when a script gets used. So I've put together something here for us. Let's unfreeze it. So if I open this up and I look down here, I have all this information that it's going to be logging. It's collecting the computer name. It's collecting the username, collecting the project information from our document. It's going to collect the project number from the document. And then it's going to log it by just quickly writing a short line to a CSV file that I can open, and then I can see who's using the scripts. The nice thing about this is because of the way Dynamo and Grasshopper run, they're only going to log this once for every time the script gets open or recomputed. So I'm not going to argue that this is the best way to do logging, but what this is a very simple one to show and to show to this group today. So this is just writing a line to our CSV. So if I run that, and then if I open this CSV, which should be in C local data log. So I'm gonna find this text file that I just created, and you can see that we go here to the bottom, right there, 604. Did it not? May have not logged it. All right. Well, we're gonna say it did because I want to keep going. I'm sorry, guys, that didn't actually write it. But okay, so that writes the log data to the file. But obviously, if I have to copy and paste this over and over and over, then I'm gonna find there's problems in the redundancy. So then people can create packages, and packages are great. They're a great way to avoid redundancy. But our point is we don't want to just work for Dynamo. We don't want it to just work for Grasshopper. We want to be able to work in both of the applications. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to take this set of code that talks about collecting the computer name, because that's not necessarily Dynamo or Grasshopper centric. And I'm going to copy it out and I'm going to put it in a separate library. So I use Visual Studio for most of my programming outside of for most of my Python programming these days. And so you can see here, I've copied this same function, all these same steps into this this library. And if I go back into Dynamo, I can now, instead of, oh, there you go. It logged that time. Just to prove. I hate when people are like, oh, trust me, it really works. It really works. I mean, I have to do that, right? Sometimes it's live, but you can see here, so 7:20 p.m., it just logged that ran. So I'm going to freeze this so it's not logging. And then I'm going to go to this node. And if I go into here, you can see all I've done. So ignore this first part, the top part here for a minute. But all I've done down here is I've said, run this command, log usage, that lives inside of this library called utils, and give it the script name. So if I go back to my Python library, in here, here's my same call or same function, log usage, and then the file path of the script that ran it, and it gets logged. So instead of copying and pasting, instead of copying and pasting this around into multiple applications, I now just have to say, run this particular library. Now, where did Dynamo know to get that library is probably your next question. And if I don't see any questions coming up yet, so maybe I've lost everyone. But we can see here, this is the library path that I've told it to go to. So it's going to this library path. So you could set this library path to whatever you want it to be, and then it'll read this library, and then I can do any import in Python to that library that lives, and this is in Dynamo. So just to make sure that this runs, I'm gonna just add an input because it seems like sometimes do that. So add a quick input here, delete that, run that. So it ran. I saw it over here come up on my side screen. If I open this up, we can now see that at 7:22, this one logged. Now, I know you might be saying, well, I don't really believe you, Timon. So I'm going to prove it by going back to this library. So this library does not live in Dynamo. It lives in its own place. I'm going to replace username with your desk test. And I'm going to save that. And then, of course, this is not going to work, but we're going to, try it. Run that. It launched another log. And you can come down here and you can see it logged it. Oh, because it logged it when I disconnected it, and then it logged it when I connected it. So it was able to connect that. So if I need to, if I decide, oh, I want it to be stored at a different location, I can go immediately and go to this file path that's stored in my library or in a separate INI file, and then I can log all of those things to that path, even though they all live in different Dynamo scripts. And package developers, have been doing some of this kind of stuff as well. All right, I'm gonna take a breath here. So now we've seen it done in Dynamo. So let's see if we can do the same thing in Grasshopper. And this is where, we're trying to run a live demo with all these different applications. We can just, cross our fingers and hope that they all work on top of it during a live demo. So if I go to this node, which I've pre-built, you can see in here, it does the exact same thing. Utils log usage. Is there a chance we could open those next to each other? Now I'm really asking for a lot, aren't I? All right. So
You're getting greedy.
I'm getting greedy, right? Jared,
this is pull the Python. There you go.
There we go.
Nice.
Okay, so this is in Python. This is in Dynamo, and it's saying utils log usage and then some information. And this is in Grasshopper. It's the same thing. Utils log usage. So all of that kind of massive Grasshopper or Python that I had figured out, that I now understand exactly how I want to log, I've stored that in the library. It works in Dynamo and it works in Grasshopper. So now, of course, everyone's going to ask me, oh, prove that it works in PyRevit. And as soon as this Zoom call link thing goes away, I'm going to go down here. I have a special tab I built just for today. And so run log. Of course, this is the most useful script ever. All it does is it records a log. So I'm going to hit it once. I'm going to hit it twice. I'm going to hit it 3 times. So if I open this up now, I can see here the logger script py. So those are the scripts that we're running from PyRevit. Those ones were logged here. We have these ones here, which logged from Grasshopper. And then we have these ones here that logged from Dynamo. Okay? Usage logging is probably boring. So if you can think of something you would like to put in a library, let me know. So if we go into another example, let's go back to Grasshopper. And let's do these pop-up windows. So the pop-up window is just going to tell us all the element data of an element that I select. So if I go into here, you can see all I'm doing, well, actually, yeah, all I'm using is I'm using the library, and then I'm activating that library, and I'm running the preview element properties. So if I disconnect, there you go, saw it. If I disconnect this, it'll error because it has no element coming into it. And then if I connect it, I get the element I selected in Revit. I get data, I get information that I need. I could do something with that. So behind the scenes, what's happening in our library is another function, which is this guy right here. So someone had already thought about, oh, here's how I want the parameter information to be displayed. Here's how I want it to work. Here's what I want to do with it. And all it's doing is it's receiving an element. So the engine's receiving an element, and then it's returning all the parameter data as a massive string. That string is then coming up on the pop-up box. Again, the point here is not to say, oh my goodness, this is an application that's going to like change our lives as far as like this exact intent. But this is a fairly simple example that I'm hoping most people here can follow, where and then use it in other places. And this can obviously be redone. There's tons and tons of functions that we can build into this library. But then once I get into Grasshopper, all I have to do to call that library is come in here, say preview element properties, because that's my function, preview element properties. I gave it, let me go back to Grasshopper here, going a little fast there. I gave it the element. So I send the element in, everything else happens on the engine side. On the engine side, it receives the element, it goes through all of this, and then it creates a task dialog box. So maybe, something's going across your project and it's doing QC, and it just pops up every time there's a problem if they have Grasshopper open, if they have Dynamo open. So let's look at how the application of this looks in Dynamo. So in Dynamo, again, this top part just gets repeated over and over. All it's doing is saying, here's the library path I want to use. Actually, in this case, I don't even think we need most of that. I'm going to try deleting it. Oh, it's frozen. Freeze. Run. So this was all we needed to put into our nodes, and we're able to use that library. I hope the point has been, I hope I've driven it home, that it's the idea is that once you get this figured out, you put it in one place and you can use it over and over in other places. So last example, so you saw this pop up here, that's getting generated from Dynamo. And now if we want to do the same thing with pyRevit, I'm going to select an element. So like, for example, this column, my custom pyRevit, preview element properties. Look at this. We're 2 and 2 so far. I'm happy all the applications are working. Has anyone had a application crash during a presentation? It's not the best experience. But I can see the properties in here. It gives me the level element ID. It's telling me the offset. It's telling me what design options it's in. Anything moves with grid. What's its length? What's its volume? Imagine the different ways you could use that. Obviously, these are really basic. So the last example is going to be on mirrored elements, and I want to QC mirrored elements. So I'm going to go to a different screen here. Let's go to watch crash on. I'm going to go to a floor level here. So this is our floor. And then we will go to, let's start with Grasshopper here. So we'll go to Grasshopper. So I can see here, I actually don't have the mirrored elements function built yet. So I'm going to take this one, preview element data as window. It's going to work for me. Let me see if I have it open. No. Oops. Preview that, disconnect it. I'm going to use the Revit, the RhinoInside things to collect my elements. I think actually, let me go back to the library. Sorry. If I go back here, get mirrored elements in view. Oh, this is again just a trigger. So all I have to do is put this function inside of my script, and it will grab those mirrored elements. So I'm going to go back into here. I'm going to go into this, and in here, I'm just going to say utils, grab mirrored elements in view. It has no inputs, and then it's going to return something. So I'm going to put those into a variable. And if I hit, all right, there you go. It's not, that one's not behaving today at the moment. Let's try going into Dynamo just to get this. So collect mirrored elements in here, grab mirrored elements in view. If I unfreeze this, there are sometimes you have to, one thing I want to point out, if you're doing what I'm doing right now, which is running Dynamo and RhinoInside at the same time on top of Revit, they do start using the same resources and some of the same document settings. So I've found that it's been a little buggier when I have both of them running at the same time. Just something to point out here. So if I run this, that initiates this run. Now this one here will show me all the mirrored elements. Oh my, this is the Revit out of the box example file. Look at all these elements, because I mean I can't imagine why they needed to mirror all those things. But if I take these elements now, I could do something to QC them. So with that, I'm just going to grab the first item in the list just because I don't want to go too long here. So if I get all these, I get one item. That's not the one I wanted, but oh well. Spit that into here. Now I can get the element bounding box, and I can create a sphere to kind of visualize where that element is that is mirrored. So this door here needs to be fixed. We could set the color override on it or whatever you want. But the whole point is you put these things in that engine and then you're able to access them. So as our time's coming to a close, I do want to go to a couple resources that I use regularly, and they are in the comments below. A couple of them that have been really helpful if I'm working with Dynamo in Python, because some of us are not, some people listening may not be experts in Dynamo Python. The one resource I found to be the most helpful, this is going to be hilarious, is the Dynamo migration from 0.63 to 0.7. They wrote an entire document about how to do the migration because Dynamo was very different. I know it's migrated again to 2.0. But in here, you'll find really great samples of how to start your Dynamo. So some of these are saved, I've modified them, and now they are the templates that I'm using when I'm doing Python in Dynamo. And RhinoInside Revit has done the exact same thing. Let's see if I can pull that up. That's also down below in here. So if we look at RhinoInside Revit, GH components, and I scroll down here, they give us, here's a template script that covers most of your cases. So this is really nice and really helpful when you need to go back and just when you want a starting point. Then when you get inside of Grasshopper and you're doing some of this development, you can come in here and you can actually save a template. So I've saved a template. So if I create a new GH Python script, you can see here, it already has all these kind of header elements taken care of. It's also already loaded my library. And so all I have to do down here is I have to come down here and think like, okay, utils dot, and then it even gives me all the functions that exist in there. And so I might say like grab mirrored elements in view and send that to elements. test that. Sorry, it's having some kind of problem with the elements in the view. And then that's how I can use that library. And if I go into, yeah, and the same thing with Dynamo. So I start with those templates. And in order for you to use those templates, all you have to do is come in here. I'm going to clear mine out right now, actually. Remove template. Yes, set back to default. Right here, once I've put code in here, just set template code. And that'll set your GH Python to be based on a template. Yeah. PyRevit has some really awesome resources, which you can find on their developer docs. My recommended place is either the notion.so website, or if you search for PyRevit Documentation, you'll find this, I think it's like a 180 page PDF, and it gets updated every now and then, and it has a lot of information about how to use different functions inside of PyRevit. Yeah, the rest of these are all linked in the comments below. So I went really fast. I see some people's yeah. Any questions, Jared? Anything that it brought up that you think we should discuss? Obviously, had a couple technical difficulties, but that can be expected with 5 applications all running
Yeah.
at the same
Probably had
time
something to do. I was
during a
thinking it probably had
demo.
something to do with trying to grab that active view from 3 different places. But yeah, no, I thought that was a good overview. Definitely, if people have questions, put them in the chat. One thing I think that I would just stress about, this whole, one of the big benefits is not only for those of us who are Python developers or writing a lot of code, not only does it make our lives easier to be able to reuse code, but it also kind of allows other people who are maybe just starting to learn Python and things like that to be able to kind of, they don't have to write an entire function from scratch. They can just do a quick import and like start to dip their feet in the water and be able to utilize things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's like another really great advantage of being able to put everything in a library. The way that you've shown here. So it makes it more accessible to people who are like dead set on like, I am a Grasshopper user. I don't touch Revit or Dynamo. Like I don't want to deal with that. So and then those people they can still use the tools that someone else might be writing for a Revit application or things like
Yeah,
that.
and I've actually done this exact thing. And people who are developing packages, people who are making DLLs with C#, like they understand this. But I think in the last year we've seen a huge influx of people who are starting to program and starting to get into this. And if Python is your first like language, and you're coming out of visual scripting, this is a good first step. Because like what Jared you were saying, is if you maybe have figured out a more complicated function, then other people can just use it. It's just in the same way as we have packages in Python that help us answer some of the more complicated questions. I mean, like I'm actually going to pull up one more here, and Jared, sorry, I'm going to just go over top of our screen here. But here we have process list. So what this does is you just give it a function and you give it any amount of nested tree elements, and it will process that entire list. Go ahead, screenshot this. You'll also find something similar in a lot of the Python nodes in Dynamo that go through something like this, so that it doesn't matter. I'm going to take that off the screen now. It doesn't matter if you're feeding it an object, or if you're feeding it a list, or if you're feeding it a list of lists. It's able to handle it no matter what. And so that function can kind of take any function and any amount of nested lists and process kind of an element level function on any list. So that's just one I wanted to kind of like show with regards to what you were just kind of talking about. Is like once you figure something out, you figure out like a really fast way of doing like geometry matching or classification or bounding box matches that can all be reused. So yeah, well, thanks for hosting me. It's
Yeah.
kind of fun being on this side, a little more, a little stressful. But I appreciate everybody being here, and tune in on Thursday for our next session. And if you have any questions, once we go off live, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to those later on in the week. With that, see you guys.
Cool. Thanks everyone. See ya.